Welcome everyone to Smart Health Talk Radio Show, and I'm your host Elaine McFadden, and I'm here with my guest today, Jay Feldman from Beyond Pesticides, which is one of the top pesticide nonprofits in our country. It's been around since the 1970s, and Jay Feldman is one of our utmost experts on pesticides, which I think today we're discovering more and more just how important that really is. Because if you listen to the news at all, at least not necessarily the news that you hear on television, but the news that you're getting on Facebook and other social media, you may hear things like that glyphosate and Roundup is actually cancer causing, according to the World Health Organization, at least probably cancer causing, which to me, that kind of says cancer causing. And if you go to our main website, which is smarthealthtalk.com, you can also find our interview with the American Cancer Society. And the American Cancer Society, their top statistician, Dr. Kenneth Portier, he reviewed the research and he agreed that glyphosate, which is in almost all the food we're eating now, is something that we should be avoiding, and especially those at high cancer risk should also be avoiding. So I want to get right into start picking Mr. Feldman's brain here, because he is like got his pulse in Washington, D.C. He's got his pulse on what's really going on with our organic program, with our organic foods, with pesticides and different laws that are being passed. And I just want to welcome Mr. Feldman to our show. Hey, Jay.
Hey, Elaine.
Okay.
Thanks for the invite.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization, and give us some idea on some of the things that you guys are working on right
now. Okay. Beyond Pesticides was actually founded in 1981.
Oh, 1981. Okay.
Yeah, grew out of a series of field hearings in the 70s that identified pesticides, especially among farm workers and small farmers, as a critical area of public health protection and worker protection that was not adequately managed and regulated by the federal government and state governments. So we held a series of field hearings in which we brought the lead regulators from federal agencies that intersect, principally EPA, but also the Department of Labor, intersect with farm worker safety, and really conducted a series of field hearings in which regulators could see firsthand and hear firsthand from workers as to what they were experiencing. And that led to the Worker Protection Standard, which was adopted in the early 1980s, 83, 82, 83, somewhere in there. And recently updated this last year by the Obama administration. So the issue, of course, hits farm workers first, because they're the folks in the field. They're harvesting our food. They're handling the pesticides. They live near the fields. The children are exposed by virtue of being with their parents, literally, on at least the edges of the field. And so, it made a lot of sense for the EPA to be taking a much closer look at this issue of exposure. But it didn't take very long to quickly realize that exposure transferred from the field to the farm, farmers' gates, and then to our food plates. This is not a far leap, and certainly the same kinds of issues we were addressing in terms of agricultural exposure, drift, water contamination, inhalation, absorption through the skin, all of these issues literally translated over to the non-farm environment by virtue of, eating food and the residues that are on our food, being in parks in our towns, our front lawns, backyards, treated with pesticides, the water we drink, contaminated with pesticides. And so the range of issues that farm workers experience firsthand also are experienced by the general public in terms of both direct and indirect exposure to pesticides. So we founded this organization seeing a gap, a real gap in the advocacy and the information that was available to the public so that people could take informed action, so they could really understand what was going on here and effectively seek to avoid use of these materials. Didn't take us long to move into organic advocacy because we really, back then, of course, organic was viewed as very fringe, sort of for hippie backyard gardeners.
Yeah, I was selling organic produce, so I know exactly what it was like. I was called a health nut.
Exactly. And, back then, if you were to testify before the agriculture committees of Congress, which have jurisdiction to this day over pesticide safety issues, big problem, because these are not committees that focus on public health, environmental protection, or worker protection. And as a result, I think our laws, our federal laws, have evolved with a bias toward dependency and use on toxic chemicals rather than evolving with a recognition that pesticides may not be needed, pesticides are harmful, that the scientific studies are showing us the range of adverse effects. So those issues don't get a really good hearing, an adequate hearing in the agriculture committees of Congress, but be that as it may, here we were in the ag committees of Congress. And, in those days, I'm talking the early 80s, when we went into the Congress, and especially ag committee, and said, look, we don't really need to be focused on just how do you use pesticides safely, because we were finding more and more, and of course this grows out of the work that Rachel Carson did and her book Silent Spring, that whole orientation and awareness that these chemicals were invading our lives, that there was involuntary and continues to be involuntary exposure, and that in effect we should be more serious about the advancement of alternative practices. So we created something back then called the Organic Farming Act. And this was this was an attempt to really shift research dollars in USDA into support for organic. I mean, it was...
Because there were like $0 going...
$0. Yeah. And there's still a minuscule amount.
Yeah, the amount of dollars that are allocated to organic research, organic farming, even the organic certification program, to me, are minimal.
That's right. So this, but back then, of course, the way to begin to institutionalize organic as a solution was to get USDA to do something that would begin to look at this. So the bill didn't pass in the first year, so we changed the name to the Agricultural Productivity Act, and it passed, and it set up the low input. It set up the low input sustainable ag program at USDA, which now is changed into the SARE program, SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program over at USDA. And this does provide some resources for both research and transition to organic production. Of course, the law that then followed, so that was 1983, the law that followed in 1990 was the Organic Foods Production Act, which actually set up that symbol now that we all see on food in our stores, our grocery stores, USDA Organic. And that set up a process whereby we created uniform standards across the country, or at least a minimum standard that identified organic food as being in compliance with standards. Now, it's really important to understand that that law was set up by Congress at a time when neither Congress nor organic consumers nor organic farmers trusted USDA. There was a healthy distrust that this government agency that was walking lockstep with the chemical industry into promotion, advancement of chemical intensive agriculture would be housing organic standards, and all that went into the development of those standards. So we created something called the National Organic Standards Board.
And that actually translates today. Sorry to interrupt you, Jay, but it's upsetting to me when I hear so many people today that still feel that they can't trust that symbol. And I try to tell them how much these farmers have to go through to even be certified, and that absolutely that they can trust that. And so if sometime as you're explaining all this, you could also explain to people why they should trust that logo, the USDA certified
organic. You hit the nail on the head, Elaine. I mean, the lack of trust of government is probably, we understand why that exists. It's understood why people don't trust chemical companies and they don't trust government, and with good reason in many situations. And so, understanding that, we created this independent board. Now, the independence, has limitations because the appointments are made by the Secretary of Agriculture in numerous categories. There have to be 3 conservation environmentalists. There have to be 3 organic farmers, 3 consumers or consumer organizations, a certifier, a scientist, and retailers. And that 15-member board is supposed to be the sounding board. It's supposed to be the way in which the public has its voice heard on organic standards.
So it's not just the USDA, it's all these other people.
Just the USDA. And in fact, this power of the Secretary was limited under the Organic Foods Protection Act insofar as USDA may not allow materials in organic agriculture, certified organic agriculture, that are not first recommended by the National Organic Standards Board.
And we know some of the things that have been happening lately is the USDA is still trying to override the rules that were set up by them. But thank goodness for organizations like yourself, because to me it is that 15-member board, but it's also beyond pesticides. The Center for Science and
Center for Food Safety.
Food Safety, right. Yeah. And these other organizations that are like, hey, we're watching you. We're keeping track of what you're doing.
That's right. Well, but this only works when we have public involvement, right? So the public has to exercise its right to clean food and to...
So we should be involved instead of just thinking you guys are taking care of all this and the board's taking care of all this. So we need to be monitoring what's going on. Okay.
So... one of the key elements of all of this, really, when this board was set up, was that we recognized that this couldn't be tyranny of the majority, that organic would never work, would never really be trusted or be a meaningful standard unless all the parties to the production system and to the retail system and involving consumer expectations, that all of those elements were treated respectfully and honored as essential to organic growth.
And we didn't dilute it. We didn't pass things that were diluting the original vision.
And so we created, and I say we because I was one of many people that sat around the table hammering out this legislation with Senator Leahy from Vermont and Representative DeFazio from Oregon. They're known as the fathers of the Organic Food Production Act, and it's very important that they continue their oversight over this program. But the key here is that the board was established and it required a 2/3 majority vote. 2/3 majority vote to allow materials, recommend standards, and advise the secretary. That's significant because it basically says that, look, we're going to create a diversified board. It's going to represent the organic community, and they're really going to have to strive to reach consensus or near consensus to move policies ahead. And if this board cannot reach consensus on allowing a synthetic material in organic as the exception to the default assumption that we're not using synthetics, then that material would not be allowed. And then we did something that was at the time revolutionary. It is to some extent still. And we created a sunset clause and said we don't want to create an indefinite reliance on these exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
We want these things to go away as quickly as they can under the banner of what we call continuous improvement. You know, a lot of what happens in organic, and now we're moving into organic land care and all these things, is really generated by a market incentive. It creates we need investment dollars to encourage the private sector to see a market and see an opportunity and therefore invest in the development of those products. And so it's this concept of incentivizing alternatives is key. So the default assumption that a material will not remain on the list or allowed under the national list of allowed and prohibited substances, as we call it, that's a provision of the law, that whole process really requires this sunset provision. Because
and that's where you guys are doing a review periodically where you go, okay, we now have a replacement to
right.
something that we allowed before because there
Exactly.
was a limited quantity available, that now we can replace that with something better that's more organic and more
Yeah.
in lines with our standards. And that includes not just what's used in the field and production, but what's used in the certified organic products that are processed, like a cereal or a mac and cheese or something like that.
And in fact, that's Elaine, that's where most of the synthetics are actually used, is in the processed food area.
Right. And so that's is that the National Organic Standards Board? Is that
right? That's the national list of allowed and prohibited substances. The board has to approve those materials as allowed in processed food. And so we end up with materials like carrageenan or guar gum. We end up with coloring.
Which are really controversial, and there's
very controversial materials. And so this is where the public plays a very critical role. And so the NOSB is deliberating on these materials.
And they just met not that long ago, too.
They just met in Vermont last month. And so that process engages, or at least allows for public engagement. And it is at that point where a Federal Register notice goes out, there's an open docket, the public can submit comments, and then the public can attend a public meeting and make their voices heard.
I've always wondered, like, okay, we hear that, like 100,000 comments were made, that kind of a thing. Now, how do they really use those comments? Because I want people to feel like their voice, even though it's one of 100,000, that their voice is really heard. Do they have a special committee that goes through those comments and that they organize those comments and then present it at the board meeting?
Yes, exactly. So, the board is broken down into several subcommittees. It includes a crop subcommittee, a livestock subcommittee, a materials subcommittee. There's a policy and development subcommittee and a certification and accreditation subcommittee. So all these subcommittees meet throughout the year. They develop these recommendations. They publish these recommendations, and then they seek public comment on these recommendations. I sat on the National Organic Standards Board from 2010 to 2015, or the beginning of 2015.
Did you see where there was like some undermining trying to go on by certain companies? Because it was my understanding that companies that have, like Smucker's, for example, they have Santa Cruz organic juice,
right?
But they also make conventional products. And so to me, those companies are buying products like carrageenan and things that they use in conventional in large quantities. And so for big discounts, so to be able to use that ingredient in their organic products, it's probably beneficial to them financially because they're already getting a big discount.
Well, there are a couple of things going on here. One is the big food manufacturers believe that the best way to grow the organic market is to compete head-to-head with the conventional market. So what that means is if there's DHA conventional milk, where we add synthetic DHA to the milk, even though you can derive DHA.
And explain to people what that is, because they may not understand.
Well, this is an additive that has been picking up a lot of momentum because it's associated with brain health. You know, it is
It's in breast milk.
it's in breast milk. It's in a lot of fruits and vegetables. So you can get this in your diet naturally. But because of its association with improved health, it's been added to a lot of conventional food products.
So we have even more over here. You know, we've got
Right.
this
And
added
you know, a
to
lot of pediatricians will tell you that this isn't even good for kids, you know, that this level in their diet is not good. You're actually harming the child.
because
It's
we know that mega doses, because before when we were talking about like the 80s and that, I remember when taking mega doses of supplements became
yeah,
like the big rage, but then we found out that there's a downside to mega doses,
right.
and that to me is like what you're just saying right there.
Right. And so, I mean, fish oil is another way of increasing the DHA in food products. Some of the organic manufacturers do that. But the bottom line here is that if a manufacturer sees that's where the market is moving, they want to ensure that organic isn't left behind. And my question is organic a differentiated market in which we differentiate organic in the marketplace and at the point of purchase explain to consumers why something may be in a conventional product that is not in a natural product or an organic product, where other sources of this nutrient may be.
And
Uh,
that's with regular fortification as well, like of cereals.
that's exactly right.
You know, because you look at like Total Cereal and they say, oh, we have 100% of all of these nutrients. But when you look at like the source of those as a synthetic, chemical additive that costs virtually nothing,
Yeah.
and then you look at the organic cereal and you're looking at the nutritional panel and you think, well, shoot, this doesn't even have anywhere near of the nutritional value that this Total Cereal does. But
Right.
yet it has more of the real nutrition
That's
because
right.
because of the products that are used in there are actually
Or
grown.
maybe that isn't the proper source of nutrition, of nutrients. Maybe we get our nutrients through natural sources, through a more balanced diet.
Which is,
That
as a dietitian, that I want to see people doing instead of these synthetic sources from real food.
well, that's the point. And
Yeah.
and another good example, which really sort of pinpoints the problem we're having in the same arena, is head-to-head competition at the point of sale. Is the whole issue of carrageenan, which is a stabilizer.
And explain what that is too, because
Well,
not everyone completely
basically,
understands it.
it's actually derived from seaweed, but it's synthetically derived.
I
So
remember
there's
seeing big plants in San Diego where they made carrageenan. These big,
right,
and there were like all these pipes going all these different places.
right. So it's an
Very
extract with
processed.
synthetic materials, and as a result, there's a chemical change process there that defines this thing as organic. There is a lot of medical documentation on irritation to the stomach.
I've seen kids with their lips like swollen and rashes and
Yeah.
things like that from
Right.
allergic
We
reactions.
tried as a board to take this out of infant formula as a starting point, and the NOSB, we think this is one of the the NOSB passed it, and this, I believe, is one of the violations
That
of
just at the
USDA.
last meeting last month, they still
This was a couple of years ago, and the the National Organic Program, which is the program of USDA that implements the law, refused to implement that recommendation, which we believe is an illegal action by the USDA. But here's the point. The reason the manufacturers want that is because of something they call mouthfeel. So think about it. We as a society have gotten to the point in the conventional market where we have gotten used to a certain mouthfeel for our chocolate milk or our juices. And now organic wants to compete with that mouthfeel. Well, you know what the distinction between the conventional and the organic product is? Shaking the product. Shake well. When I was growing up, virtually every juice, chocolate milk, had a sticker on the top of the bottle that said "shake well," and it was the shaking and the mixing of the particles.
I do that with my Strauss organic whipping cream that I put that's in my coffee right here. It comes in a jar, it comes in the glass bottle, and the cream is at the top.
That's right.
and I have to shake it to distribute that
That's right.
other heavy
It's
cream.
good exercise, actually. You know,
Yeah, I don't mind.
shake your whole body, right?
Because I tell you, it makes my coffee taste so
But
good.
this is the level we're doing, where we're operating at. Some will say this is the only way to
Because
grow.
that keeps it mixed to where you don't have to shake it. Is that what you're saying? The
That's what I'm
carrageenan?
saying. It
Okay.
suspends the particles in the mixture, the juice, whatever the liquid is, and that suspension is what they're looking for. That even suspension within the juice product or the liquid product. So this is the level we're talking at, and there's a clause in the Organic Foods Production Act that talks about essentiality. You can try to make a case that we need a synthetic material in organic production or processing, but you really have to make an essentiality case. And I would argue that that material in particular is not essential to organic. And the industry, especially the big food industry, would argue that these are the products that make the competition feasible, that make organic competition in the marketplace feasible.
It's a hard call because I worked for Nature's Past Cereals, and they had a hard time competing because they didn't add B12,
Right.
and they didn't want to add that because they felt
Right.
like it compromised their product. By adding this other ingredient, it wasn't like really supposed to be there, but and again, you're competing against these other companies, and it's dog eat dog out there when you're a company trying to stay in business.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
tough.
another good example is sulfites in wine. We had a big fight around whether sulfites added, so we're talking synthetic sulfites, because
Yeah,
wine,
and they are synthetic, right?
right? Well, wine produces sulfites naturally, okay, but most wineries want to add the
And why
synthetic.
why do they add it?
Well, it's a preservative.
Oh,
It basically increases shelf life. It allows a longer period of fermentation or
and
whatever.
they don't have to tell us what's in these or alcoholic products, even the mixers, which
Right.
is something that to me that's very upsetting because they are not. Is anyone working on that where the alcoholic beverages and mixers are required to list their ingredients?
I don't know about the details on that, but I can tell you in the context of sulfites, the big issue was whether the product could be listed, that we're talking wines, could be listed as organic wine as opposed to wine made with organic grapes. Because we have a made with category. The made with category in organic was created to incentivize the creativity of the market to move to the organic label, the full organic label. And I'll
Right,
tell you,
in the true sense of the word.
exactly. So as a consumer, I'd much prefer to buy a product that says made with organic vegetables, listing all the vegetables, and knowing what is not organic in that product, rather
Hmm.
than being misled essentially by the organic product, organic,
Well,
mac and cheese. So if
yeah.
the flour's organic and the cheese is organic, but maybe the spices aren't organic, or there's just not enough of that product to get to the 90%
And the
organic.
standard of identity of what is a true, even with milk, I know that there has been some talk about milk because of the adulteration that
Yeah.
goes on in making like a non-fat milk product, because you pretty much taking it apart and then putting it back together with these other additive ingredients that aren't really in milk to begin with, like titanium oxide for one thing. And should that be able to be called milk?
Right.
You
Well,
know, so
it's a good analogy. I think what's happening is we're having these discussions around the growth of the organic market, and two camps here. That is, we can get more land into organic production if we allow more synthetics into processed organic food.
because
The
we're
argument
making it
was
easier. You're making it easier
You're
and
making it
cheaper.
easier to sell the processed organic food. And, our concern, of course, is that as we dilute the label, the meaning of the label, that people that are walking around saying, well, local is just as good as organic, which is certainly not the case,
No.
uh, then, it gives power to that argument. And, we need to maintain the integrity of organic so that people, the critics, and, most of the critics that are out there are typically the chemical side of the argument that are basically seeing their market erode over time. We've got a $40-50 billion
We
organic
don't need you anymore, kind of a thing. We're not going to buy your product anymore.
Right. And so, we are seeing this shift in the market, and it's because consumers are making a food choice, at the point of sale. They are making choices that are protective of their families in terms of eliminating pesticide residues from they don't want GMOs in their
Growth
food.
Hormones in their milk.
They don't want genetically engineered organisms. And so what we have to do as this market grows, we need more public involvement to ensure that we don't erode the integrity. Now, this is integrity around the edges, one could argue. This is not the basic how we manage the soil, how we grow the food, commodities, whether it's corn or soybeans or vegetables. That's the staple. That's the main core issue, certainly in organic. But when you start introducing products and putting that really treasured and honorable organic label on that product, you do have to worry about those other additives that are put into the base product, the base commodity. And that does become part of this definition of integrity, because that's where it's sort of like the Achilles heel. If you do everything right, but then you add that one thing at the end of the process, you have undone everything, all the work you put into.
And I would just wonder if there's incentives, because as you're saying that, and I'm thinking about, okay, we want to sub out this synthetic ingredient like carrageenan with an organic alternative. It would seem to me, when we're looking at allocation of funds within the organic program, that some sort of funding for incentives for companies to develop those organic alternatives, because it's going to be harder. It's going to be hard for them to get started with that product, because they're competing against something cheaper that's allowed in the product.
Yeah.
And so if we had some sort of incentive that's subsidized, because we've got all this subsidization going on for, GMO corn and milk and all these things, but, where is the subsidy on things that really mean something, to improving our food supply? And I would like to see something like that.
Yeah.
Where we could subsidize.
We're at a stage now where everybody wants in. Everybody wants that label now, because it is the growth sector in food.
It's the biggest growing food sector of all.
Growing agricultural sector. So, hydroponics wants in.
Okay, I am so glad you said that, because I was just in my head as you were. I want to ask him the hydroponic question, because I just kind of went head
organic
to head.
was established as a soil-based system. That's
integral
to what organic is about. We are, and that's for a number of reasons. Organic is an environmental protection system. It's a public health protection system. And this system is based on how we treat the land and how we grow our food. It is essential to not only protection of health, water, aquatic organisms, wildlife. It's really essential to carbon sequestration and impacts on global climate change. We start with the soil, and so does the Organic Foods Production Act start with the soil. And that's the orientation that we need to stick with when we talk about organic.
I went head to head with someone during, when the meetings were happening there in Vermont. A guy made a comment that was from the hydroponic industry about, we should be allowed to have the organic label on there. And I just kind of really came back at him hard, because in my mind, It's about the soil. It's not about, because to me that it's really going back to growing with chemicals. You're not growing in the soil. And when you look at the soil, and that's what I love about my interviews with the Rodale Institute,
Yeah.
is because I love going down to, like, or if you read the Soil Association, and read about all the information on there that they help educate people. There's things going on in the soil that are like magical. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a huge community in there that's like there's millions and trillions of things going on within that
Well,
soil.
we visited Uncle Matt's orange
Oh
grove.
yeah, I know Uncle Matt. Yeah,
At-
their brand is really great.
at our national
In
conference
Florida.
in Florida this year,
Uh-huh.
and get out into the field. And Benny McLean, who
He
manages,
was on the board.
uh,
The guy from Uncle Matt's was on
Yeah.
one of the boards. I know.
yeah, he stood in the orchard and he's telling everybody how they manage this. They're in an area of conventional agriculture, and they are as productive, probably more profitable. They're managing citrus greening without the toxic chemicals, without the neonicotinoids that are being used on their neighbors' fields. And he says, we have a saying on our farm, and it's microbes drive the bus. It's the soil microbial activity. It's the awareness of the value that brings to the ability of soil to produce nutrients, to produce organic matter and biomass.
And how that works
to
for
feed
me
the
as a
plant.
dietitian, how that's working in our body, the nutrition that's being created in the food,
That's right.
and then how that in turn works in our body to prevent disease.
Right.
And
So then you see these other systems coming to the NOSB, to USDA, and asking for the label. Well, in the case of hydroponic, the National Organic Program went over the heads of the NOSB, went around the NOSB against a recommendation that prohibits soilless agriculture,
okay,
and allowed the actual labeling of this. They did the same thing with aquaculture, imported aquaculture, which is the same thing. And the bottom line here is
that's
that
so
these
upsetting.
these are systems that are inherently based on and dependent on synthetic inputs.
Yes.
An organic soil-based system is not inherently dependent on synthetic inputs, because the whole basis of it, when you develop an organic systems plan, a farm system plan, and you submit that to a certifier, an accreditation agency, what we're looking at in that context is how are you managing the soil so that the plant can derive the nutrients it needs and create the resilience that it needs to protect itself from infestations and diseases, so that you can eliminate, or at least to the extent possible, eliminate synthetic inputs. And you can take any synthetic on the list that is allowed in organic food production, and you will see that material being used not on a regular basis, not on a schedule, not inherent to the production system, but rather added in cases where it is needed because of some failure. Could have been brought on by outside forces, weather conditions. It could have been brought on.
But the core that you're talking about is that you will be completely independent of added chemicals. That is the ultimate
Whereas
goal.
when you take a hydroponic system or an aquaculture system, which I visited these fish being grown in nets in the bays off of the coast of Maine. I mean, they're fed synthetic materials. They
GMOs.
That's the source of their diet.
Pesticides.
And they need nutrients.
Antibiotics.
These are synthetic nutrients. And they need other materials. It's not clear yet.
They
In
even
fact,
vaccinate them.
we expect USDA this or next month or early next year, could be this month or December, to come out with proposals on allowing organic aquaculture. And again,
that's important since they just
system is
approved
inherently
GMO
dependent on
salmon.
synthetic. That's the problem. It's not a system. Now, you could perhaps develop an aquaponic system, in which you've got a closed loop, which you're creating the nutrients, you've got a balanced ecosystem in there, and you have fish in a system with in an aquatic system with balanced and natural
And then
nutrients.
that's still going back to some sort of part of the composting, which in turn goes on the soil. So I could see where aquaponics could fit in a system like that, but not where it's independent of the soil, where you're not including the
Right.
soil in the system. And that's pretty much what you're saying, right? Is that soil needs to be there. The soil needs to be part of the system.
So, again, this goes back to why is public involvement critical? When the policy development subcommittee of the NOSB developed its implementation standards, or basically guidance for how to implement the statute, how to manage the NOSB, one of the key elements in we call it the Bible, the policy development committee creates a policy and procedures manual. That manual creates the transparency. It establishes and institutionalizes the transparency by which the public engages in this process and is able to evaluate what this board is doing. And one of the key elements, the foundational principles in that document is meeting public expectation. That if we don't meet public expectation about what organic is and what it isn't, then we will lose this label.
Because the people, they know, it's amazing. Once they start getting educated on like the things that we're talking about today, once they get that in their brains, what comes out, they start to come up with the same conclusions we do, don't they, Jay? They're like, wait a minute, that doesn't compute. That isn't logical. That doesn't make sense to me that would be the right way to do this. And so we know that once we provide the information to the masses, that they will, in the end, come up with the same consensus decision that we have.
Look at it. When organic first started, we at Beyond Pesticides, we have sort of a bifurcated program. We work day in, day out to try to keep EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, accountable to standards of public health protection and environmental protection. We do that by commenting on specific chemicals that are allowed in agriculture, like chlorpyrifos, Dursban, bad 2,4-D, like glyphosate, Roundup, all these nasty chemicals. We're submitting comments. We're litigating. We're doing everything we need to do or can do within the public process. Do we think we're going to change EPA and the stranglehold that chemical companies have over that agency and the committees of Congress that have oversight? No, we don't really think we're going to do that. So then we create an alternative system in the marketplace by which consumers can voice their concern about what they want to feed their families, vote with their dollars, and how they're going to protect the environment. And that's created.
What they're going to feed their family.
And how was that created? At the same time that we had some progressive members of Congress, or even progressive people we think of as progressive leaders of the Environmental Protection Agency, standing up and telling the public, chlorpyrifos is safe in your food. Your food supply is safe. At that very same moment in history, and this is the 1980s and 90s, we had this growing organic sector. Growing because people said, you know what, I hear you, but I just don't believe you. I don't agree that we are doing what we should be doing to protect our children, to protect the people, all of us who are eating food. And so the organic market keeps growing. It grows by $1 million, $2 million, $10 million a year in, year out, to this $40 billion industry. Now, as that industry grows, it becomes clear that it needs some oversight, protection for the consumer that has built that market. The consumers built that market. Not to say that it wasn't built in collaboration with organic farmers, but organic farmers growing organic food alone does not make an organic market. It requires consumers believing in what they're doing.
And they had everything against them. I mean, they had billions of dollars, being spent against organic. Besides that, they still were growing, And
most of these organic farmers did what they've done at tremendous personal sacrifice.
Yes.
Their families...
Yes. Thanks for saying
they're
that.
stewards of the land. You talk about protection of pollinators. who are the protectors of pollinators?
Right
Organic.
now, yeah, who are protecting them? It's certainly not the chemical industry. They're killing them in the millions and millions.
Right.
We had the peer group on, the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility group,
Right.
and they had a USDA whistleblower that they
Yeah.
kept trying to tell, that this pesticide is like killing millions of bees. And he kept refusing to believe it. And then finally he saw it firsthand and he just couldn't ignore it anymore. And he contacted them to say, hey, it's actually worse than you thought.
Yeah. Well,
That was just
this
like,
is
oh
why
my gosh.
organic is so important because, as you look back to Rachel Carson, she started with, DDT. She focused our attention on DDT and the organochlorines. And that's a constellation. It's a family of chemicals, or chloridane, heptachloroaldrin, dieldrin. I mean, these chemicals have bioaccumulative effect. They store themselves in fatty tissue. They
stay in the soil. They stay in the water.
Soil. So,
they get more concentrated.
And there was enough public pressure on that, we moved to organophosphates. And those chemicals as well showed residual activity, showed neurological damage, in some cases cancer. And then we moved to synthetic pyrethroids, and now we've moved to these neonicotinoids. And you know what? We said, the regulators said, we just had a meeting with EPA the other day. They basically said, look, we were looking for a way to reduce human exposure. So we were really thrilled to see that there were systemic pesticides. So you could coat a seed, put that seed in the ground, and then the plant would express the poison through the pollen and the nectar and the glutation drops. And lo and behold, we eliminated worker exposure. And you know what? We never thought about the impact that would have on beneficial organisms, on organisms that are central to ecological balance. We didn't look at the impact that those chemicals
like this narrow view. They don't even
right,
look at the
on
big picture.
Pollinators, on bees, on birds, on butterflies. And so now we have this tremendous problem with a chemical that has, is also bioaccumulative. I mean, not in the sense of organophosphates, but it resides in the environment for a very long time and doesn't degrade. And so it's history repeating itself with yet another family of chemical. The only way to get off of that treadmill is to embrace organic, because organic doesn't use any of those chemicals.
And we don't need it. People think that they have been brainwashed into thinking that once we take the pesticide away, we're not going to have enough food. Right. Or food is going to be too expensive for any of us to buy. And what do you say to them, to people that try and say that? What is your response?
Well, first of all, supply and demand, we know in our marketplace, reduces demand reduces cost. As the demand goes up and the supply goes up, the cost goes down. People that have been supportive of organic have paid more. There's no question about that. And they've created the ability of the marketplace to drop the price. I mean, now we have Walmart being the biggest supplier of organic food in the country. Now, obviously, we have to do that. Growth has to be accompanied by adequate oversight. We have to be assured that there's adequate certification, that the systems that are currently in place grow and expand to cover, to make sure that this increased supply is adequately implemented in a way that enforces the standards that are critical to public health protection and compliance with the law. And so, that's happening. That's in process now. We're going to have to shift more resources away from the subsidies you talked about on the conventional side. They should be taxed. Every time they use a chemical to grow food, they should pay a pollution tax. That money should go to investing in organic growth and organic enforcement, organic oversight of that system. When you look at the two food systems side by side and you look at how do we monitor what kind of oversight exists on the conventional side, you can look at the U.S. Government Accountability Office and a report that came out this year that basically says we do an inadequate job of monitoring the residues of
the residues, exactly. And that's a good measuring tool. It's a quantitative measuring tool.
Exactly. And so on the organic side, we don't have that problem. We don't have to worry about that problem.
Well,
What
just
we
like
do,
those families, they test their urine, right? There was one recently, the Swedish family, and like everyone in the family, when they tested their urine, there was multiple pesticides in their urine.
right,
And then when they switched to the organic diet, the pesticides practically became non-existent. I mean, what more do you need to see?
right.
That right there to
So
me was,
we do live in a polluted world. We are in this transition period, and we have organic trying to live with GMO next door. And the reality is there is genetic drift. We also know that toxic chemicals get into compost. So we have to be very careful in this transition
and
period.
there's legislation going on with the compost right now, which I found really interesting. That I know that there was a win in court about that because the USDA tried to dismiss. They wanted to allow pesticides in compost
Right.
that was used on organic fields. Can you
Well,
just
we
explain that a
sued
little bit?
USDA because we believe the organic law is extremely clear on this. We
Mm-hmm.
cannot allow contaminated compost. The whole point of this was to not allow residues as determined as acceptable, representing acceptable risk by EPA, but ratcheting those allowed residues down to a very small percentage of allowed residue on the conventional side. And we did that because we recognize that there is pollution. Let's face it, we walk outside our front doors, even if we live in a home where we purify the air, and we're exposed involuntarily to pollutants in the
It's
ambient
in the
air.
rain. The Roundup is in the rain, and I've read a study where it was able to drift 1,000 miles
Oh,
through the
yeah. We
rain.
have transcontinental drift of these chemicals. So the point is that we need to make the polluter pay for the contamination they're
I
causing,
love that idea.
yeah, to the organic crop. So if I find Monsanto's genetic material on my organic field, in my
Yeah,
organic crop, the polluter, Monsanto,
you bet.
must pay for
Instead of
that
suing the
violation.
farmer for having their
That's an
DNA.
involuntary exposure. It's causing a problem for growers who are showing up to sell their crop, and the monitoring occurs, and they find that there's contamination. That has an economic impact on the organic grower.
Well, explain to
Same with the
people we can
compost.
detect this stuff because I think people think that we don't know what's like really in there, that we can't detect this. But explain to people that there we have technology now. We know what the heck is in there. We know. Well, I did have in my conversation with Dr. Hansen from Consumers Union. There are times like with processing things like even plastic or the oils, when you have a heavily processed product, the DNA can get lost and
Yeah,
become undetectable because of the processing.
right.
But we can detect a lot of these GMOs in products, and when they tested the natural products, they found all kinds of GMOs in there,
Right.
multiple GMOs in
And this is
natural
a
products.
function, this is a function of a society in which we have not been able to contain materials, whether they're toxic materials or genetic materials, to the use site because of nature. I mean, because nature is uncertain. We have, weather patterns, we have drift, we have runoff into waterways, and this off-target, because this is not intended pollution, but this off-target pollution is causing harm. And organic can create the model for production process. We call it a process-based law. It defines what is allowed on that production site, but it cannot prevent the off-target contamination of those sites. We try, and we do this at the expense of organic farmers. Farmers are often required to establish buffer zones around their farms. That takes land out of production. That hurts the organic farmer. Who's causing the pollution, though? It's not the organic farmer. It's
Why
the
are they
chemical
being
intensive
punished?
production. Right. So, there are a lot of what I consider transitional issues, meaning as we as a total society transition from chemical intensive agriculture to organic production systems, we are still experiencing growing pains and how to really assign the true cost of chemical production with all its externalities to the chemical producer and the manufacture of those chemicals. That's incredibly important right now, not the reverse of that, which would be to minimize the organic standards, dilute them, weaken them to accommodate for this pollution that's being caused by polluters. So when we get to contamination of compost, we feel very strongly that we have to enforce a very strong standard as to what is allowable, what contamination, what level
Well,
is
that it's
allowable.
labeled properly, Jay. Something I find very upsetting is when people go down and they see organic on fertilizer and these products being sold at the home improvement store, and they think they're buying a certified organic product when really that is sewage sludge.
Right, those are biosolids. So again, that is not allowed under the organic law.
So why are
And
these Kellogg's and
unfortunately,
these other companies getting
well,
away with that?
unfortunately now the organic law needs to expand to non-food production areas and needs to get into turf. Turf management is an area in which we spend a lot of time because it's a high exposure area for children. It creates a lot of involuntary exposure in communities where we live as our neighbors.
What's happening right now, Jay?
Many
Because I
times
know in
unintentionally.
Montgomery County they passed, and if you could just explain that a little bit, because I thought that was monumental. Hope you enjoyed part one of our interview with Jay Feldman from Beyond Pesticides. Please tune in next Tuesday, 7 o'clock p.m. Pacific Standard Time for part two of our interview with Jay as we get into the organic industry in even more depth. We want you to understand exactly how the organic industry works so that you can have confidence in the products that you're buying. You'll continue to support organic food companies and organic local farmers. Thank you so much for tuning into Smart Health Talk. I'm your host, Elaine McFadden, and please stay tuned right here to KCAA.